So today we're going to be talking about navigation, MVC, and delegation. Okay. So first, we actually need 20 people for a user research study. So for Uplift, anyone who does this will receive extra credit. So we just need, if you scan this barcode right here, you can also go to that URL. We just need 20 people to do this as part of user research. So if you guys could help out, that'd be great. Give you guys a couple minutes just to scan. Okay, cool. Okay, so now that you guys have been working with constraints, we actually have a very useful tool for you guys. If you go to this link and you have any sort of constraint error, you can literally copy and paste the exact error into this link, and it'll tell you exactly what's wrong with your constraints. So this can be very useful if you have no idea what's going on, because constraints can be pretty messy sometimes. Yeah, so here's what it looks like. You can literally, from your console, just copy and paste the error message in there. There we go. Okay, so last time I sort of briefly mentioned frames, and that's another way you can do UI in iOS, but we prefer to use constraints because your apps are going to get a lot more complex, and we want our constraints to depend on the different devices you can have in iOS. You can also use storyboards, but we really prefer not to do this. We want to do everything programmatically. So here are just two different ways of doing UI, but we will be focusing on auto layout. Okay, and then also, a lot of you guys asked for some extensions, and just make sure that extensions have to be requested at least 24 hours in advance. And we do have the right to deny you guys an extension, which is unfortunate, but just make sure to do that 24 hours in advance. And if you need to email us, just make sure to email us there, and we'll get back to you. Okay, so some review for you guys. Can anyone tell me, how would I center a UI view in the screen? Yes. So you actually, so you need to center you need to set both the center X anchor and center Y anchor properties to center it in the screen. You would think that there would be something like just center anchor, but you have to set both center X and center Y. Okay, so you guys know how to create apps that just have one screen. In your projects, you just use one UI view controller. But most apps actually have a bunch of different screens and view controllers going on. So how do we actually create apps that have multiple views? Okay, so we have this new thing called UI navigation controller. So what this is it's pretty much a way of maintaining a bunch of different screens in your app. So oftentimes, in the Messages app for iOS, at the very top you have this bar that says Messages, and you have this table of all the different messages and conversations. A UI navigation controller maintains an array of view controllers, and is pretty much maintained as a stack. So you can think of all of your screens are this stack in your app. And once you press on a button, you can navigate to another screen. So here's an example where we initialize a view controller up there, and we use this navigation controller property, but we can access this inside any view controller. So we can just assume, the reason why we have the question mark there is because this is optional inside our view controller. So our view controller may not be inside the navigation controller, so that's why it's optional. So we have these two methods here called push view controller and pop view controller. So if you guys are familiar with a stack, just in programming, you push onto a stack and you pop from a stack, right? So anytime we tap on a button and we have a navigation controller and we want to push a new screen onto our app, we can use push view controller to do that. And if we're on our current screen and we want to go back, we just call pop view controller. And we can also pass in this argument called animated. And if you've ever seen just the screen just slide to the left or right, that's because animated was set to true. So we prefer animations. Okay, so this is in the Photos app in iOS. And we have this is actually called a UI table view, which we're using to display all these cells, but we're going to talk about that much later. So oftentimes when we tap on one of those cells, we're going to navigate to a new screen in our app. So what happens is that we will call push view controller on our navigation controller, and that will take us to a new screen in the app. Oh, there's an animation there. Go back. Okay. Okay, so this is what you guys have probably seen in a lot of iOS apps, and this is what happens whenever you push a new view controller onto the top of your navigation stack. So that was just a cool little animation. Okay, so here's a more, I guess, detailed view, but like I was saying before, we have this thing, don't worry about that NS array, but every single UI navigation controller has a set of view controllers, and it's pretty much all of the view controllers in our stack. So if we start in that Photos app, we have that initial view controller, and we tap on a button, and that will take us somewhere else. And both of those view controllers are going to be maintained inside our navigation stack, that view controllers property. So it's pretty much a way of maintaining different screens in your app. And we also have a navigation bar, which you see at the top of the screen, and then a toolbar, and then this thing called the Delegate, which I'll talk more about later. Okay, so you don't actually have to always, if you want to navigate to a new view controller in your app, you don't always have to use UI navigation controller. You can also just use the present and dismiss methods inside any UI view controller. So if you've ever tapped on something in an app and then a new screen comes up from the bottom, that was presented modally. So that left to right presentation for navigation controller, that's not modal. Modal is bottom to top. So inside any UI view controller, we can always access this method called present. And this will do that. It'll present a new UI view controller from the bottom to the top on your screen. And if you want to leave that view controller, you can also call the dismiss method. And don't worry about this completion argument here. That's a function that will be run after you present or dismiss the view controller. But you can just set that to nil for now. And we can also animate this with the animated argument. Okay, so has anyone ever seen this before? Okay, cool. So this is the Transit app. And this is a list of bus stops that you can go to on campus or off campus. So this is a UI view controller. And if we tap on a button, we want to go somewhere else. So we can either use a UI navigation controller for that, or we can present a UI view controller modally. So I think I have another video for you guys. Okay, so how did we just present that inside this app, do you guys think? Can anyone tell me? Yeah.
That's Modal.
Exactly. Nice. So as you can see, if I play it again, the new screen comes from the very bottom of the screen. It's presented upwards. So that's modal presentation in an app. Yeah, so that's just an example. And okay, so in any iOS app, we like to stick to tradition, right? And a very common tradition, a very common design pattern in iOS development is called model view controller. So what this does is it's an abstraction where what you just saw in the Transit app, we can create models to represent our data. So we could represent a bus stop with a class or a struct in Swift. And then we can use views, which were those different cells that we presented on the screen, to display the data. And then a controller, which in our case is just a UI view controller, that manages whenever the user clicks on one of the buttons. So all the interactions that happen in your app, the controller manages and then updates the views and then the models as well. So this is a very common design pattern that we're going to use throughout this entire course, model view controller. Yeah, so like I just said, Transit is a perfect example. So we have bus stop objects, we can create models for those, and then Eatery is another example where we can have a model for eateries, and then you have different UI view controllers. Yeah, so model view controller is what you want to get used to as a design pattern in Swift. Yeah, and like I said, so yeah, the view part in this design pattern is going to be all those different cells that the user can tap on. And then the controller will listen for those taps and then update the view anytime you tap on it. Okay, so a very common case in iOS apps is we are on one view controller that was presented by another, and we make a change, either someone taps on a button or something like that, and we want to tell our old view controller, hey, we've just done something. We want to actually communicate with our other view controllers in our app. So we can't really do that directly because once we're inside one view controller, we can't access another unless we have something called delegation. So delegation is a way to actually communicate between different view controllers in the app. So what you do is you create a protocol, and then you can have one object, it could be a view controller or any other object in Swift, and you delegate one object to another to perform an action. So this is very much like interfaces in Java. So you can have different classes that implement interfaces, and they have to implement the functions inside those interfaces. So we're going to start with an analogy, and let me know if this makes sense. Let's just assume we have a chef, we have a customer, and we have a menu. All right? Now the chef knows how to make the items on the menu, and we could have a customer who can order any item on the menu, right? So the menu is a protocol. Let's think of a menu as a protocol. And the customer wants the chef to make food for them, right? So we're going to delegate the chef to make our food. So the chef is the delegate, right? And the menu is the protocol. Okay, so this is actual Swift code right here. So here we created this menu delegate. And whenever we create a protocol, it's pretty much a set of rules, right? It's a set of things that we want to do whenever something happens. So if we tap on one button and we want some other view controller to do something, we want to delegate that other view controller to our current one through protocols. So here the menu itself is the protocol. So we want our chef to make us steak. So whenever we want steak, whenever we order steak, we want our delegate, right, our chef, to actually make us steak. So what we do is we delegate the chef to the customer. So inside our customer class, it's not shown here, but pretty much we have to set that delegate property inside the customer to be our chef. But in order to do that, if you see our chef right there, it's of type menu delegate. That means it conforms to menu delegate. So our chef, because we have that colon syntax with menu delegate, that means that our chef has to implement all of the methods inside the menu delegate protocol. So now, if we take away that function make steak, our compiler is actually going to yell at us because we have to implement it. So let's assume we initialize a chef, and we also initialize a customer, and we delegate that chef to the customer. Inside that delegate argument, we pass in the chef because it's the chef who conforms to the menu protocol. It's the chef who has to make the food, right, for the customer. So can someone tell me what happens when we call customer.orderSteak? Yeah. Exactly. So what happens is that inside that instance of a chef, we call that function make steak, and that will get printed to the console. That's right. Is everyone all right? Does anyone have any questions about this? Delegation? We good? Okay, cool. So oftentimes, you're going to have a UI view controller that conforms to a bunch of different protocols. So what we did before, I'll go back to it. Yeah, chef, we explicitly said chef conforms to menu delegate, but if you have a bunch of protocols, it's going to look really messy, just having comma after comma. So what we often do is actually create extensions in Swift for our view controller or whatever, and for every single protocol that we want to conform to, we will create an extension for it. And we still have to implement all of those methods. But inside the extension, it's still inside the view controller. So inside that function here, did change color, you can still access all of the properties that are inside that view controller. All of that is still there, but it's just in a different place to make it look more neat, and organized. Okay, so let's say that we have one view controller, and then we have another view controller, but inside the other view controller, when something happens, we want our original view controller to do something. So we want to delegate our other view controller to our current view controller. And we will do that by setting this property delegate to self. Can someone tell me what I'm doing there? Why did I do self? Set it equal to self. Yeah.
Saying the present view controller is assigning itself as the delegate for the other one.
Exactly. So in our other view controller, now we have this delegate property, right? So delegate is pretty much the thing that we want to do something when an action happens, when we want to make a change in our app. So we have this function here called tell view controller to change color. So we're using this function of the delegate here, delegate.digChangeColor, because we can't actually make a change in another view controller from a different one, right? That's why we have to use delegates. We can't just say, okay, original view controller dot do something. We have to use delegates to actually communicate with the other view controller. So if we run this function tell view controller to change color, what do you guys think is going to happen? Any ideas? Yeah.
Is this after the last code snippet?
Yeah.
Will the one that was called present view controller is going to use its change color?
Exactly. So if I go back, yeah, inside here, we're assuming that we've already implemented that function, but he's exactly right. The original view controller will call its didChangeColor method. Okay, so Jan is going to do a demo for you guys to show all of these concepts, but just remember that Project 3 is going to be due on October 20th, 11:59, and then the add deadline for this course is October 30th.
Okay, so we're going to start with a fresh Xcode project again so that we can go over, we're going to switch microphones. Okay, we're going to start a new Xcode project so we can go over the whole process of starting a new project. So if you guys just take a minute to open your Xcode. Cool. And then to start a new project, you can either just click Create a new Xcode project or go to File, New, and select New Project. Okay, and then in hopes to kind of standardize this so everyone has the same initial view controllers, we're going to go and select a single view application and just click Next. For product name, you can really make it whatever you want, but for the sake of your projects, you guys should be doing netid_p and then the project number, and we highly recommend that you do this at the very beginning, so when you're creating your project. So I'm just going to use L because this is lecture 3. Because if you try to rename your projects after the fact, a lot of the times a lot of things will get screwed up and you'll literally have to copy and paste everything. So just avoid that by making your netid_project and then project number your name. You guys can ignore all of the team, organization name, identifier stuff. Make sure your language is Swift. And then select storyboard for user interface if you have that option. Cool. And then just click Next. You can save it anywhere you want and hit Create. Cool. Awesome. So you guys should have an app delegate, which we're going to use. But then if you have something called scene delegate, you should right-click that and delete it and move it to trash. If you have a main.storyboard, you should right-click and delete it as well. And then also move main.storyboard to trash. And then in your info.plist, if you have something called application scene manifest, you should hover over it and select the little minus symbol and remove that entry. And if you have something called main storyboard file base name, you should do the same thing and delete that as well. Cool. Did everyone follow or have any questions about that? Cool. Does everyone also already have a viewcontroller.swift file?
Is that what you get for picking the view controller option instead of the storyboard?
Yeah. 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 I think it will default to being the name of the app. Yeah. So it'll default to make your display name your project name, which is what will show up on your simulator. But for like the purposes of your project, that's fine. Cool. Okay. And does anyone have a content view.swift? You should delete that as well if you have it. And then inside App Delegate, if you have a section with the title Mark UI Scene Session Lifecycle, you should just select all of the stuff under that except the like final closing bracket and delete that because that seemed to cause some issues with some projects too. Okay, is everyone up to speed? Everyone has what they think is the correct setup. Cool. So now we can start with basically the first step in whenever you're creating a new application, which we went over in the last demo. But we need to create the window for our application. So first we're going to declare a window property. So that's UI window. And then we're going to actually encourage you guys to use your autocomplete because that's one of like the nicest things about Xcode. The autocomplete functionality on it is like amazing. And sometimes like we don't even know like the full names of the methods and we kind of just type a couple words and hope it'll suggest what we want. So yeah, declare your window property and then exactly like we did in the last lecture, we want to create a UI window and we want to select the constructor that has a frame so we can specify how large it is in terms of like the rectangle. And to get the whole size of the entire screen, you're going to do UI screen dot main dot bounds. And basically that will create a window that's the size of your entire screen. Next, we want to set the window's root view controller, which if you think of in terms of the stack that Matthew was talking about, is the one that's on the very, very bottom, so the root of your whole hierarchy. So if you do window dot root view controller equals, following what we did last week, we just did view controller. So if you have a view controller file already, this should be fine and it won't error. If you don't have a view controller file, you'll have to create one. Does everyone have one? Awesome. And then the last step is window.make key and visible, which will make our window visible so you can see it. Awesome. So these are like the very, very starting points for any application you want to make, except we're going to make a minor change here. And because today we want to create an application that has a navigation controller, instead of making our root view controller just our view controller, we're going to do UI navigation controller. And then if you select the constructor that has a root view controller property or argument, this is where you'll specify the starting point of your navigation controller. So the first one that will show up when you launch your application. And that's going to be our view controller. Okay, any questions so far? Cool. So now if we go into our view controller file, we actually put some code on Piazza, and it's pinned at the top. So if you go to Piazza and go to the lecture 3 note, you're going to copy all the code in part 1. Just copy that. Go back to Xcode and select the entire override func view did load and just paste there. Okay, did everyone get that? Cool. So if we run this as is right now, I'll just show you guys what we had so you guys can understand what we put in on Piazza. So basically what we did in that code is we created two buttons. One of them says push navigation VC, and one of them says present modal VC. And the goal of this application, we're going to do this. So when you select push navigation view controller, we're going to use a new view controller and the navigation controller to push a new view controller on the stack and then pop it off when we navigate back. And then the other button is going to present a view controller modally. And if you change the text here, well, it's frozen. If it didn't freeze, if you type something and dismiss and save text, it'll change the button's text on the home screen. Cool. So that's all we did. We just provided all the code for creating those buttons. Cool. So when we push that one button that says push navigation VC, we wanted to present a blue view controller. And in order to do that, we have to create a new view controller for that. So in order to create a new view controller, if you navigate up to the top and go to File, New, File, it'll open this dialog. Make sure you select Cocoa Touch Class, hit Next, and then make sure you're creating a subclass of UI view controller because we want to be creating a new view controller. I'm just going to call this blue view controller. And then just hit create in the default place that it puts it. And then you have this new file that's for your new blue view controller. You can leave the commented out part, but just so it's easier to read, I'm just going to delete all of that. And like we talked about last time, you can always access the view of any view controller that you're in. And then in order to set the background color, you're just going to access the background color property and set it equal to a system color. In order to do that, you can just do dot, and then a bunch of options will pop up, and we're going to use blue. Cool. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So now we have this new view controller that has a background color that's blue. In order to get this to show when we select push navigation VC, remember last time we talked about creating buttons and adding targets so that if you look at line, well, it's 26 on mine, we've already specified that when we select the push nav view controller button, we want to call this function called push nav view controller that we already declared at the bottom. If you scroll down to there, this is where we're going to create an instance of our blue view controller and then push it onto our stack. So in order to do that, we can just create a new instance of our view controller. And then make sure you're using blue view controller and not the view controller that you're already in. And then like Matthew talked about, you can always access the navigation controller and then use the push view controller method, which has the arguments of a view controller and a boolean for whether or not you want this to be animated. So since the view controller that we want to push, we saved in a variable called view controller, we're just going to pass in view controller for the first argument. And because animations are always cool and they look nice, we'll just set that to true. Anyone have any questions about that? Cool. So if we run our app right now, if we select push navigation VC, it pushes this nice blue view controller. And you'll see at the top, this is our navigation bar, which Matthew also talked about, and it's already automatically put a back button in for us, so we can go back to our original view controller. So now we see we have this empty bar at the top, and a lot of the times applications have a nice title label on the top, and that's actually really easy to implement. So if you go to viewcontroller.swift, we have a comment that says, set the navigation controller's title. And you can access the title property and just set title equal to whatever you want it to be. We'll just call it navigation demo. And then you can do this in any view controller that's embedded in a navigation view controller. So if I go back to blue view controller as well, and I do title equals blue view controller, and you run this again, you'll see at the top of the screen where the nice bar is, it'll have the text navigation demo, and then when you push the blue navigation controller, you have blue view controller. So thinking back to the stack that we were talking about in the lecture slides, this is like you have your original view controller on the bottom, so this one, and then when you select push navigation view controller, that puts this blue one on top of it, and when you select back, it pops it off so that you're left with the original view controller that you had as your root. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. So now we want to make a red view controller that we can present modally. So we're going to start with that the same way. We need to create a new view controller file. So to reiterate, you go to File, New File, select Cocoa Touch class, and make sure you're creating a subclass of UI view controller. And I'm going to name my file red view controller, and then just create it in the default location that they select for us. I'm going to delete the extra comments that we don't need. And then we have a lot of stuff on the screen, so we also have code on Piazza for this part. So if you go back to the same post, scroll down to part 2 and copy everything in there. And then select over the view to load function and paste on top of that. You have a whole bunch of code that handles all the UI components and the buttons because it's a lot and it would be a lot to go through right now. Did everyone get that pasted in? Cool. So because we can't present this yet because we haven't hooked it up to our button yet, I'm just going to say what it does basically. We created a UI text field, which you guys may have used for project 2, and a button that says dismiss and save text. So if you think about the example I showed you, we had that bar where you could enter text and a button where you can say dismiss and save text, and it'll change the button's label on the root view controller. Cool. Now, in order to present this modally, we have to look at what function we specified as the selector for our present modal view controller button. So the function that we used was present modal view controller, which we declared at the very, very bottom. And in here, the kind of steps for presenting this are very similar to presenting it as if you were pushing onto the navigation stack. We need to create an instance of our view controller. So let view controller equal red view controller this time. So we just created an instance of our red view controller. And then we're not going to push this onto the stack. Modally, we'll actually just put it directly onto the view controller that you're currently in. So you don't have to do navigation controller dot present or anything. You can just use the present method that they have. It's the one that has view controller to present as its first argument. So similarly to the pushing and navigation view controller, we want to pass in the view controller that we want to present. We're going to animate it so it looks nice. And like Matthew said, you guys don't have to worry about completion handlers for now, so you can just set that to nil. Cool. So if we run this now, we can take a look at what happens. If we select present modal view controller, this red view controller pops up modally. So this looks a little different than the demo video because Apple changed how modal view presentation works. Same idea where it slides in from the bottom. And then you can see that we haven't actually done anything with our dismiss button, so selecting it doesn't do anything. But if you're familiar with kind of interacting with iOS apps, you can just drag down on something that's presented modally to dismiss it and return back. But ideally, for a good user experience, we'd want to be able to hit this button and dismiss it in case people aren't aware that you can drag down just to get rid of it. So in order to do that, if we go back to red view controller, we have the button dismiss and save text, and we've made its selector this method called dismiss view controller and save text. So we're going to focus on just dismissing the view controller for now. If you scroll down to the bottom of the file, we already declared the function. And similarly to how we just presented it with the present function, we can use the dismiss function. And it has the arguments animated and completion. So we're just going to use true and nil, similarly to how we presented it. So now if we run this now, we'll see that when we present the red view controller and select the dismiss and save text button, it dismisses and goes back to the home screen. Cool. Is everyone up to speed? Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Is there no title for the
Yeah, so because Modal presentation doesn't use the navigation stack, it doesn't have the bar across the top of it because that's specific to the navigation controller. And when you present modally, it kind of just puts it directly inside your current view. Cool. So the next thing we want to do is learn how to pass information or communicate between two view controllers. So we want to grab the text that we enter in here. I don't know why Cool, that's not good. We want to type in here, select dismiss and save text, and update the text in the home view controller. So in order to do that, we need to use delegation, which we presented in the lecture today. So if we think about the restaurant analogy again, with the customer, the chef, and the menu, in our case, our customer is our red view controller, and it wants to tell view controller, so then root view controller, to change its button's text. And in order to do that, it needs to specify its menu, which is what it wants the delegate to do. So in our case, that's change our button's text. So if we go into view controller and we want to declare a protocol, use a protocol keyword. I'm going to call it change button text delegate of class. So this is a class delegate protocol. And like Matthew said, if you're familiar with Java, this is very similar to an interface in Java, in which any view controller that conforms to this protocol is going to have to implement whatever functions we put inside our protocol. So we want to change button text. And we want to tell it what it should change its text to. So the new string is, we're going to have to pass in the new string. So this is kind of like an interesting way to label your arguments. When you actually call this, which you'll see later, it'll just have the to as the argument label, and the new string is actually the parameter that you're going to pass in. It's a little kind of confusing right now, but when we call it later, it'll make more sense. So in order to conform to this protocol, one way that you could do it would just be to tag it along to the end of UI view controller. And then we'll see that we get this error that it doesn't conform to our protocol. And that's because we haven't implemented the change button text method yet. But like Matthew said, there's another way to do this to keep your code a little cleaner. And if you kind of go to the bottom of your file and make an extension of view controller with the extension keyword. So you need to name it like the same name as your file, and then here's where we specify that we want to conform to this protocol. Basically, this kind of just extends your view controller, but in a way so that's easier to understand and see what you're conforming to. And we get the same error again, and if you click fix, it'll automatically kind of put that the header for your function that you need to implement. So I want to change my button's text. If my button was called present Modal view controller button, does anyone know how I would be able to change the text of this button? Any guesses? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that would be new string because that's the argument to our function, and we're just doing dot text. Oh, it's not dot text. Set title, yeah. Set title. Cool. So then we pass in the new title, which is new string. And then for control state, you guys don't have to worry about too much, and we're just going to use the normal state. So now, if I were to call this function, I would change my button's text to new string. But I want to be able to have my red view controller call this function. And in order to do that, I need to add a delegate to red view controller. So like Matthew said, we have to add a delegate property to our red view controller. And typically for delegates, you'll make them optional instead of like force unwrapping them like we did for the UI components, because we're not sure if we'll have a delegate or not set. So now before I dismiss my red view controller, I want to call my delegate and tell it to change its buttons text. So I can go delegate dot, and we'll see that it already auto-completes this for us to change button text. And you'll see that, like I said before, when we declared this function, we had like to new string as kind of the label, but then when you call it, it just has to and then string for what you're changing it to. So it's a little, that way it's a little clearer for you when you're reading your protocol to understand what's happening. And then, does anyone know how I would grab the text from my text field to pass it into my delegate function? Does anyone have a guess? Dot text of what? Yeah. So text field dot text. Cool. And then does anyone know why I get this error or how I could fix this error? Yeah. Yeah, so because the text field may not have text, it's inherently an optional property. So I can use an if let to unwrap this, if let text equals text field dot text. And then you can actually chain Boolean expressions to your if let functions. So I only want to update my buttons text if my text is not the empty string. So in order to do that, I can do text not equal to open and close quotes. So that will first check if my text field's text is not nil, and then check if it's not the empty string. And then I can move this line delegate.changeButtonText to textfield.text into the if let function and just pass in the text variable. Cool. So now we'll first call our delegate to change this button's text and then dismiss our view controller. Now, there's one thing that we still have to do. We haven't actually delegated or set the delegate for this view controller yet. Does anyone remember from the presentation how we would do that? Does anyone know how we would set this view controller's delegate? We kind of talked about it briefly in the slides, in the examples. It's okay. So if we go back to view controller, right before we present this new red view controller, we want to set its delegate to be our current view controller. So viewcontroller.delegate equals self. So self will just refer to the current view controller that I'm in. So what I'm doing is I'm setting my instance of my red view controller's delegate to be the home view controller. Does it make sense? Does anyone have any questions? Cool. So now if we run this, and do present modal view controller. Cool. I don't know why that keeps freezing on me. Can people type in theirs? Yeah? Okay. I don't know why. If you guys press dismiss and save text after you type in it, does it update on the home view controller? Yeah, okay, so we're just gonna assume that worked because I don't know what happened with my keyboard. But yeah, so now you'll notice, I'm just gonna run it again. Now you'll notice that whenever we select, is that the right one? We'll just run it again. Whenever you select present modal view controller, and you push the red view controller, its text is just placeholder, because that's what we set it to be in the red view controller's view did load. But you can actually tell this view controller, or let's say we wanted to tell this view controller, populate your text field with a placeholder text that's the same as the buttons text on the home screen. We can do that with a custom initializer or by declaring a text property in red view controller. So if we just say var text field text, cool. We'll see that we get this error that says red view controller has no initializers because I've declared this property text field text that has no initial value. So if you say fix, did that? That didn't fix anything. Cool. Oh, it fixed it by making this an empty string, which is not what we want. We want to create a custom initializer for our view controller. And that means that when I invoke this function, just make that empty for now. I want to provide a string that should be the text field's text when I initialize this view controller. So if I do text field text of type string, you'll see once you declare an init, like your own custom initializer, you'll get an error required initializer needs to be inserted. You can just insert that and kind of ignore it. You have to do it. But now whenever we initialize our view controller, we have this text field text property. And in order to we want to grab this text and set it to be our text field's placeholder text. So we can access our text field and just set its text equal to the text that we pass in when we initialize it. And then you'll also get this error that super init isn't called. So because we're like a subclass of UI view controller, it has a superclass that's just the normal UI view controller. And you have to call its init function. And you want to use the one that has nib name and bundle as its arguments. You don't have to worry about those. Just set them both to be nil. Oh, cool. No. So let's not do this way. We want to set our text field text to be the text field text that we pass in. And similar to Java, if you were to use the this keyword to refer to your properties, you have to use self.textFieldText. Yeah. And now in view.did_load, instead of setting our textField.text property to placeholder, we can set it to the textFieldText property that we have. So I know that was a little confusing. Does anyone have questions or not understand what the purpose of that was? Yeah.
Can you explain again why we need to create a new initializer?
Yeah, so you don't have to have one, but we want to be able to pass the text on the button on the first view controller to our red view controller so that the placeholder text in the text field is the same as the button on the home screen. So that way, in order to do that, we can just create a new initializer so that when we create an instance of red view controller, we can pass in the current button's text so that when we load this view controller, we can grab that text and set it to the text field's text.
So every time we want to change the text, we're creating an instance of the red view controller with the new text.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
So every time we click the button to change we enter the text and change the button, we're creating a brand new controller with that text.
This is for when you push the button on the home screen, the first view controller. Hold on. Mine is a little broken. So we have this text present modal VC change my name for this button here. And we want to accomplish a functionality where we can make the text instead of placeholder, we want it to be whatever we've named it on the home screen. And we can do that by kind of passing that information when we first create red view controller. Yeah, so now we have this error now that we've added this initializer. If you go back to viewController.swift, you'll have an error when you create your instance of red view controller. And it says you can't invoke an initializer for type red view controller with no arguments. So the default kind of initializer for this would be a empty, basically like an empty constructor if you were to be analogous to Java, but providing no arguments. But then once you specify your own initializer, so with the init that we just created, this kind of default no argument initializer goes away, and you have to use the initializers that you created. So if we do the open parentheses again, we'll see we have the initializer that we created with text fields text. And here I want to grab the text on my button, so I can use present modal view controller button dot text, not text, title, I think it's text, no, title label dot text. Well, I have to unwrap it, so if let title, no, I think there's another way to do this. Present modal view controller button dot title, current title. Maybe not. I'm gonna check what it's supposed to be.
I think you can use that, but you have to unwrap it.
I have to unwrap it. Okay. I thought there was one that you didn't have to unwrap, but apparently not. Yeah, so here's the scenario where we don't actually remember everything and we just kind of use the autocomplete to figure out what exists or not. So we'll just do title label dot text.
Or you can do title and then for normal. There's like title for.
Or we want to grab the text, not set the text.
Right, but it returns the text. It's like title for.
There we go. Title 4, and then the normal state. Try and build that. Cool. And then ideally you should avoid using this, but we know that we've set the text of this button when we loaded it, and we know that whenever we pop back to it and modified its text, we've also set it, so we can be pretty confident that it won't be nil and we won't run into the fatal error. So if you run your app now and you select the Present Modal VC button, you'll see that instead of placeholder, in the text field you have the button's text from the home screen. And that's because when we initialized our view controller, we first passed in the string that we wanted, and then in the viewDidLoad function for the red button, we set the text of the text field to be that string. Does that make sense? Does anyone have questions about that? Cool. I have a feeling this isn't going to work again, but if you guys modify this with your keyboard and then press dismiss and save text, it should change on your home screen, and then when you push on it again, it should be whatever you changed it to, if someone wants to try that. Yeah?
I was wondering, why can't we just force unwrap this? Because I tried putting it empty and it still works.
Why couldn't you just...
Force unwrap the text inside the text field.
Here? When you initialized it?
No, inside the red view controller. When you're about to save the text.
Oh, you could just unwrap it if you were very confident that you're going to have text. So you could just use the exclamation point to force unwrap it. But we also want to check that it's not equal to the empty string, because then if you set your button's text to that on the home screen, you won't be able to see it. So this is just kind of like a catch edge case sort of thing to do. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Have people seen how it's supposed to work on their simulators? So yeah, I think that's the end of our demo. If no one has any more questions, just as a final reminder, Project 3 will be released later tonight, and because we have fall break this coming week and no class on Monday, this is going to be due 2 Sundays from now. And then the add deadline for this class, if you still haven't enrolled on Student Center, is October 30th. Cool. That's all.
Go back to the present modal view controller
Yeah. Here?
Nice.
I don't know what happened to the simulator.
Oh, no, it's cool. What was happening because of iOS 13, I think. It happened actually before. Just none of the text fields were working. But our problem was that we had this thing called it was like write text or something. So here, text field is this week.
At least someone's working.
Yeah.